Welcome to News Decoder's webinar on war in Ukraine. My name is Nelson Graves. I'm the founder of News Decoder, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm joined on camera by students from 5 News Decoder partner schools in 4 countries. And students, could you introduce yourselves now, please? Sophia, perhaps we'll start with you.
Yes, my name is Sophia, and I'm from Denmark, and I attend Halfsum School.
My name is Emma, and I'm also attending Halfsum School in Denmark, and I'm a second-year student.
Yeah, and I am as well.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Sophia. Maria.
So good morning, everyone. I'm Maria Jose Corredor. I'm a student from Ignacio Los Caballos, which is a school from Colombia.
You're in Bogota, right?
Exactly.
Danielle?
Hi, everyone. My name is Danielle. I'm attending SOS Kamamina International School. I am based in Ghana, and I'm in my 11th year.
Thank you, Danielle. And Kea?
Hi, I'm Kaya Simmons. I'm a senior at Miss Porter School from the United States.
On holiday right now, but joining us nonetheless. Thank you, Kea. In a moment, I'm going to introduce the 4 News Decoder correspondents who've joined us, and we'll launch the discussion. But first, just a tad of housekeeping. We want the discussion to be interactive, and we urge you to participate. And you can ask a question or make a comment at any time by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can even vote for questions that you think are best. So please take advantage of this function. The session will last 1 hour. We'll start with a conversation among those on camera, and then we'll open the discussion up to Q&A. Now, the 4 correspondents on camera have extensive experience in Ukraine and the surrounding region, going back decades. First, I'd like to introduce Elaine Monahan. As a student and later as a Reuters correspondent, Elaine lived in Belarus, Berlin, Russia, and Ukraine, and she speaks French, German, Polish, and Russian. She lived in Berlin as the Soviet Union started to collapse, and then in Warsaw when her husband was US President Barack Obama's ambassador to Poland. Now, Elaine, my first question to you is, what keeps you up at night about what's happening in Ukraine?
I'm tempted to just say everything. There are a whole lot of things. I suppose the first and foremost is that everything we've seen so far happening by order of President Putin tells us that he will not stop. There's no reason to believe he will decide that human blood is not worth shedding for whatever his goals actually are. Which appear to be taking as much of Ukraine as possible.
Is there any silver lining in what's happening as far as you're concerned?
The silver lining for me is to see the way that refugees are being welcomed into neighbouring countries, and as always that we see the best and the worst of humanity at the same time in any war situation. So to see the way that Poland and other countries are welcoming refugees across the border is something to be celebrated.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elaine. Over to Julian Nundy. Julian's links to Ukraine go back more than 50 years to September 1968, when he started a 1-year studentship at Kyiv Shevchenko University. He was a correspondent in Moscow for Reuters and visited Ukraine on reporting trips. And on the foreign staff of the Independent newspaper in 1990, he wrote about prospects for Ukrainian independence a 1.5 years before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Nundy has been a member of election observation missions for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, covering 8 Ukrainian elections. In 2019 and 2020, he was based in the Ukrainian-held part of the Donbass for 4.5 months. Julian, welcome. Thank you for joining us. What keeps you awake at night about what's happening in Ukraine?
Well, the short term and the long term, really. I've worried for friends that I have there, places I've been, some of which have now been under very serious attack. I'm in touch with 2 Ukrainians on a daily basis to see how they're getting on. One of them is in Kiev. The other one is on the border with Poland. And that's, in the short term, it's sort of human, my human interest in friends and places I've been. And the longer term is, when does this stop and how far will it go? And is it going to drag the rest of us in?
What about silver linings? Do you see anything good emerging from this in the short term or long term?
Well, I agree with Elaine that the welcome given to refugees is encouraging, but it's a very, very small silver lining.
Thank you. Now to Jonathan Thatcher. Jonathan was Reuters bureau chief for the Commonwealth of Independent States, which comprised all of the former Soviet Union except the 3 Baltic countries, for 5 years from 2001, based in Moscow. It was a period that saw a major shift towards the West and Ukraine and some other ex-Soviet countries. It was the period when a very popular Russian president, Vladimir Putin, began in earnest to deepen his control over the political and economic life of Russia. Jonathan, thank you for joining us. What keeps you awake at night about what's happening in Ukraine? Sorry, you're muted, Jonathan.
About that.
Now you're with us.
Yeah, well, it's all this technology now. I think it will get worse. My concern is Putin feels cornered, and therefore there's more incentive for him to increase attacks rather than look for a negotiated solution, at least in the shorter term.
And what about good? What good might emerge from what's happening?
Bizarrely, I think the way the president of Ukraine has come out of this, and perhaps within NATO and the West, that you see much more cohesive behavior, and perhaps that will bring those sides a bit more strength. But I don't see many silver linings there.
Thank you, Jonathan. And Danielle Warner, former deputy to the director at the Graduate Institute, Geneva. Warner trained young diplomats from Ukraine and taught at the Ukrainian Diplomatic Academy. He's lectured extensively in Russia, and he's appeared frequently on Russian media, probably not so recently. Danielle, what's keeping you awake at night about Ukraine?
Well, I mean, obviously, I'm worried about my friends and people in both Russia and Ukraine, but most of the comments so far have been political, military, and I want to change the discussion from my perspective in Geneva to legal and moral. In other words, it seems to me that Putin is threatening and challenging the entire multilateral system, the use of force, humanitarian law, human rights law, aggression, and the question is, can the system, the United Nations and all of its International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice, General Assembly, are they powerless? And it seems to me that there is a challenge to the order that was established in 1945, and how resilient can that be? Thank you. How about anything good emerging? Yes, the fact that people will say that autocrats, for example, what the 2008 war, Russia, Georgia, 2014 taking annexing Crimea, that maybe we shouldn't let those things go and we have to be much tougher. Right. Well, that's a lot of material out there already. I'd like to open it up to discussion. I emphasize conversation of those on camera, ask questions. The students have already submitted questions, so let's turn it over to them. We've heard from our correspondents. Students, your questions of one another or of the correspondents?
I do have one question. It's in regards to international intervention. And my question is that, is it possible to consider international interventions in this particular case as necessary evils? Because before the full escalation of this present war, there's actually been much evidence of Russia's ability to invade and claim what is rightfully theirs, quote unquote. And I say this because Putin acts as a form of synecdoche, has been doing this for some time. This was seen in the early 2000s and later on in 2014. So if anyone could kindly answer this, preferably the correspondents.
Daniel Warner?
Yeah, I mean, the question, when you say international, the answer is, who do you mean? Article 2.4 of the Charter of the United Nations is against the use of force and aggression. The only exception to that is Article 51, which is in self-defense. So the question is, what international body or who can intervene in this? The only time we've last seen that was in the Korean War, and the only reason permission was given was because the Soviets didn't show up. So, I mean, there are times when the United Nations can send a force for peacekeeping, but with the Russian veto and the Chinese potential veto in the Security Council, it would be very difficult to have an international force. And remember, the United Nations has no army.
Okay, thank you. So are you basically saying that this particular war won't escalate into a full-blown war due to the articles presented in the Charter?
Well, if the Security Council would say, for example, that gives permission for NATO to intervene, then we're talking about an all-out war. And the one thing that Mr. Biden, President Biden and NATO wants to avoid is a war with Russia, because then nuclear war weapons can get involved and it could really turn into something more than it is now. That's why they're hesitant about a no-fly zone.
But hasn't NATO's pledge not to intervene given a trump card to Vladimir Putin insofar as he can do what he wants at this point?
Well, I mean, the argument someone just gave me a while ago was, if he's evil, then you have to be evil to counter him. And my argument is exactly the opposite. If you're trying to uphold international law, then you shouldn't break the law. So there has to be some way that the Charter of the United Nations and that multilateral system has to function. Whether it's because the Security Council is blocked, you should note that in the General Assembly, on the agenda for peace, we had a vote. 141 countries condemned Russia. Only 5 were against the resolution, and 35 countries abstained. So there does seem to be a general feeling that Russia is to blame here.
Any other thoughts on this question from Danielle in Ghana on the matter of international intervention or intervention, outside intervention otherwise? No? We have a question from the floor, actually, from Linus Deli. How possible do you think World War III is in this situation? Are we looking at the possibility of a World War III? What do you guys think, students or correspondents? Yeah, Julian.
I think that's the question that everyone does not want to hear, because the problem is that, of course, it could escalate, it could worsen, it become a general war. And Putin himself, before this began, reminded the world that Russia had nuclear weapons, which has been a no-no for many decades, not to threaten. And he has effectively threatened use of more devastating weapons than they're using at the moment. So it could, yes, it could escalate.
May I add something? Not using the label World War III, I feel that we're already in a kind of a world war, in the sense that many countries are now involved and affected by what's happening. And there's also a kind of a war happening in our social media, in our media ecosystem, that affects all of us. And so for me, the risk of it escalating into nuclear war, which I think is what is underlying this question, for me, the answer to that is delivered by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, who've been monitoring this threat for decades, and that they are concerned, and therefore so am I.
How concerned are they, Elaine, the nuclear scientists?
Well, the last time I checked, they hadn't moved their doomsday clock any further up than it was before. But their concern is, the way I've seen it framed, is it's not likely, but they're more concerned than they have been in the past.
Daniel?
Yeah, I want to ask a question, make a comment first and then ask a question. In the 1950s and 60s, we talk about Russia, the Soviet Union, as a world power with certain world ambitions. Now we're talking about Russia as a European power what Obama referred to kind of in the European neighborhood. And I'm asking our friends in Africa and South America, is this really that important to you? And if I go back to the UN General Assembly, almost all of the African countries abstained. And Latin American countries too. So is this a European problem that doesn't really have obvious world effects? And I'd like some of the students to answer that.
Students, your thoughts on that? Are you feeling affected? Yeah, Maria.
Sorry.
Sorry, Danielle.
Well, thank you.
We'll turn to Maria and then to Danielle. Maria, please.
Thank you. So taking into account what just was said, I would like to take into account two main points. The first point is also the decisions that our president takes. Of course, as a country, of course, Colombia, we're not completely involved. However, last 2 weeks, our president took incredible decisions, he took decisions not taking into account the country. So that's how we can say that, of course, the country can be involved in this, can be affected, taking into account the decisions the president takes, because this is not how, of course, the country feels or how the country wants to act. This is more, and of course, it's only about how the president acts and takes decisions about all this whole global situation. So that's what our countries worry about, because our president took decisions of taking the army involved in this. And that's a really interesting point here, how our president takes decisions without consulting with the country. And of course, as you already said, that's an European problem. And as Colombia, we should not be really involved in this. But our president, Iván Duque, take crazy decisions, take crazy words, and put the country in a position that they shouldn't be. So it's really interesting to take that into account.
Okay, thank you. Do other students feel as if their countries are getting involved despite people not wanting such to happen? Or how do you feel yourselves? Do you feel affected in any way, students?
I'd just like to touch on that. Due to the fact that I find myself within a boarding complex, I do not necessarily feel the effects, but I tend to read on what's going on outside of my confine or my comfort zone. And so first of all, I would just like to touch on the fact that the president has made efforts to try to evacuate Ghanaians within Ukraine at this point in time, first of all. And second off, in terms of the Ghanaian economy, prices are shooting through the roof. Right now, the dollar against the cedi rate is very serious, in the sense that right now it's about 7.73 to $1. And I think one more thing I'd like to add is that Ghana is one of the 2 states found within the Security Council. And so the only thing our president has said in regards to the ongoing war is that he condemns it. So that's what's going on within Ghana right now.
Okay, what about you? You're in the United States. Do you feel personally affected by what's going on at this point?
Well, personally, I don't feel affected because it's in like the news all the time and everyone's talking about it, but it's hard to feel personally affected when I don't know anyone, or it's kind of like I'm reading about it from afar. But in the United States, I know that it's pretty divided because some people are passionate about helping out Ukraine and then other people don't want to get involved. And then I've been hearing a bunch of things about the rising gas prices, for example. That's making people very frustrated, and they're blaming the United States government. And I think different things like that are creating an environment of frustration that might lead to some change in people's opinions about being involved in the war.
All right. We have 3 questions from the floor now. One from Fabio Mathieu. What countries are affected the most by what's going on in Ukraine right now, besides Ukraine and Russia? Correspondents, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, all the neighbors of Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Poland, especially, in the first instance, all those countries that are in the immediate area.
Because
they're
they're
having to deal with the refugees, and they are the ones through whom the arms are transiting.
And eventually also the Baltic countries, what the Russians refer to as the near abroad.
Jonathan, Thatcher.
I think we shouldn't forget the global economic impact of all of this, and it's going to be, I mean, we're already seeing it with fuel prices. Food prices are clearly going to rise with grains. This is going to put enormous pressure on countries which are, particularly the poorer ones. And we've already seen in the past what you get with food riots or bread prices shooting up, etc. And I think it has the opportunity, the possibility of creating a certain amount of economic instability in the coming months. You may not see it until later in the year or whatever, but it will have an impact, and it comes hot on the heels of the enormous costs that COVID has caused all these different countries, wealthier ones or poorer ones.
So my question is
I
this.
think it's a considerable concern down the road.
Sorry to interrupt you, Jonathan. My question is this. If so many people are experiencing the effects of price rises, does it make it easy? Does it make it more likely that people in those countries would favor a quick resolution of the fighting, even if it meant that Ukraine lost its sovereignty?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we've heard from the students, that the governments are sort of dealing with the issue with Russia, but they're, if you go out in the street and buy a kilogram of rice and you find it's doubled in price, or the petrol or whatever, you're not going to look at Ukraine and Russia as the problem. You're going to probably blame your local leadership, I would suspect.
In which case, if those leaders want to save their skins, they would perhaps embrace appeasement and a solution that would come quickly, which would perhaps give Russia control over Ukraine. Is that a fear that anyone shares? Danielle.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in the comment about money and finances and economy and gasoline. I mean, going back, and you can tell by my age and my voice that I've lived through some of this stuff before. I mean, what about defending democracy against autocracy? What about defending a certain liberal order against an obvious tyrant here in an invasion? I mean, that seems to me to be important. And I understand the economic gas price arguments, but certainly there are other arguments out there that should be taken into consideration. Are they being taken into consideration? When you talk about gas prices and bread prices, hospitals are being bombed, human rights are being violated, schools are being bombed. Isn't that more important than gas prices? I mean, I'm asking the question.
What about the students? Do you feel that you yourselves, your families, your friends are willing to make sacrifices in the form of paying higher prices? If you live in Europe, perhaps weaning yourself from Russian energy in order to defend Ukraine's sovereignty, or is it just easier to buckle in rather, and allow the Russians to control Ukraine? What are your thoughts? Especially, I'm interested in the Herlufsholm students who are in Denmark.
I think that us in Denmark would like Ukraine to remain independent, especially because it's a bit what Daniel also said, that if we solve this conflict fast, but it means that Russia will get Ukraine, what will happen if other countries then see that they can go in and take back other countries? So, for example, China and Taiwan, and how would we then solve these multiple conflicts all over the world?
Also, Russia may keep its eyes on Moldova and Georgia, where they've already intervened in years past. Any other thoughts from students on this question of the willingness to make some sacrifices in supporting Ukraine, specifically in the form of paying higher prices for energy and other goods? Yes.
We in Denmark have, or the EU, like generally, have made quite a lot of sacrifices to kind of, I think we have made a new goal to reduce the gas we use by 2/3, or at least the Russian gas in the EU, which is going to be very expensive. But I feel like most people in Europe are quite willing to pay those prices, because Ukraine is just kind of the first step towards Russia like coming closer to Western Europe.
Okay, thank you. We have more questions from off camera, and two of them relate to Vladimir Putin. From Alexander Mungin: is Putin behaving irrationally? Has he gone crazy? What is his strategy? From what I've heard, he won't be able to keep up the war at its current intensity for long. And then the associated question is, how possible is a conspiracy in the Russian government against Putin? So any thoughts on what's happening in Moscow? Jonathan, you were based in Moscow. Not that you have a direct line to, you have your hand up, so you're ready to say some things on this.
Well, I mean, it was 15 years ago, so I am a smidge out of touch. But I would say on the question of Putin, within his narrative, which has sold very well to the Russian population over the years, as you can witness for the excitement over the taking of Crimea, I do not think he's behaving irrationally within his logic and what has got him into this place, the position today. I think there is a certain amount of, sad to say, consistency, and you can look at various events over the years since he's been in power. In blunt terms, he's completely brutal and has proved himself to be time and time again. Now, on the other hand, you know, I'm not going to second guess what a man is going to turn out like after 20 years of nearly absolute power and 2 years of COVID isolation. I mean, maybe he's gone around the bend, and it's pretty hard to justify what he's doing other than to say, well, perhaps it's his attempt to keep some sort of hold on power at a time when his popularity may be beginning to decline. And you can see the enormous efforts the state has gone to clamp down on the media, which has been going on for a long time. And it's quite remarkable, so that Russians are not necessarily aware of what's going on.
Thank you, Jonathan. We have Elaine, Julian, and then Danielle in that order. Elaine.
I will piggyback onto what Jonathan was saying. It's tempting to think that Putin has lost his mind, but he's actually behaving exactly as could be expected, although it's easier to see it in retrospect than it is in any other way. I think it's also worth bearing in mind his fear of losing power. He's had it for so long. He saw what happened to the Ukrainian president who was toppled in the Dignity Revolution on the Maidan in Kiev, and presumably has similar fears for his own ability to stay in power. So that's a rational way of thinking about it, I suppose.
Julian?
Well, I agree with Elaine on that one. I think he has a pathological fear of what are known as color revolutions, after starting with the Orange Revolution, or rather the Georgian Revolution the year before. But I think it would be interesting to know what's going on in his entourage. There's a Russian investigative journalist called Andrei Soldatov, who said this weekend that the two FSB security service generals in charge of the section dealing with Ukraine have been put under house arrest, presumably for getting the analysis wrong. If that is true, then what are the other FSB generals going to feel about that? They've normally been untouchable. And if these two are under house arrest, what is going on inside the Kremlin now?
Does anyone have an idea of what's going on inside the Kremlin and the prospects, Daniel, prospects of a move against, an internal move against Vladimir Putin?
I have 4 quick points. Number one, Putin always talks about Kosovo. In 1975, Conference on Security Cooperation in Europe said there would be no changes of borders. And Putin keeps coming back to that. He said, you recognize Kosovo, you change the borders. Once that Pandora's box is open, we can change borders too. Second point, there are various rumors that he's ill. His face looks puffy. There are people think he has pancreatic cancer or something else. So maybe this is kind of his last hurrah in order to reestablish a certain Russian empire within the near abroad. Third point, I was interviewed by someone in Moscow the other day, a young woman who says almost all of the young people are against this. She has a separate passport, and she's saying we're all trying to get out as much as possible. So the rumors by saying that the Russian people are all against it, are all with him, are totally untrue. And the fourth point to the young people, Putin always says the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was the end of the Soviet Union. That's worse than the 2 world wars. And the lesson of this is if you think the world is a win-lose, never humiliate the person who's losing, because someday what goes out will come back. And that's exactly what's in his mind now.
Thank you, Danielle. We have another question from the floor. This one is from Evan Kistad. Do you believe that a de-escalation is a possible outcome of this war? Otherwise, how can this situation be resolved? So can we have a negotiated solution, for example, or is it not likely?
Now, there will always be a negotiated solution, whether it's by force or by words. It's still a negotiation. So if you expand the notion of negotiation, they're always negotiating.
Okay, fair enough. The word in the question then was de-escalation. Is there a prospect for a near-term de-escalation in the conflict? If not, what happens? Elaine?
I think, Julian, were you about to speak? I don't want to interrupt you.
Well, all right. Well, there's a Bellingcat, which has done a lot of very good reporting on things going on, especially in Ukraine. They're very good on the Malaysian Boeing that was brought down over eastern Ukraine in 2014, for example. They had a report in the past few days where they think they're going to try and freeze the conflict and keep their positions where they are. I find that very hard to believe, because I think it'll be extremely dangerous for Russian forces to stop where they are. They're going to open themselves to all sorts of attacks, guerrilla attacks, forevermore, if they try and stay where they are and stay in Ukraine without taking the whole country. But that's the Bellingcat scenario, is that it should be over. The fighting should be over fairly soon.
Yeah, I was going to say, as far as de-escalation goes, I mean, you could have a de-escalation in shelling, like Russia could stop shelling civilian targets in different cities, and you could call that a de-escalation, but what would the price be on the ground after that? And I've been watching events in Melitopol, where the mayor was kidnapped by Russian soldiers and replaced by a pro-Russian or apparently pro-Russian politician who, and my great fear is that we'll start to see that kind of scenario playing out elsewhere, where we could end up with a kind of a lingering conflict that goes on for a very long time.
Daniel, Warner?
Yeah, I disagree. And the simple reason is many Russians have relatives and friends in Ukraine. And when the army was originally sent there, they were told there was a special military operation, and they were not told that it was going to go deep into Ukraine, etc. So I think that some of the soldiers are already beginning to say this is not what we're going to do, and they're already starting to revolt. I saw this in Vietnam. It was called fragging. when the soldiers shot some of the officers. So I don't think that the army and the population can stay in this for a long time. So I disagree, Elaine, respectfully, that this could go on. And I can see how Russia can hold a country of 44 million people, and there will be resistance no matter what happens. But I don't think this will go on that long.
Other parallels to Vietnam, by the way?
Oh, there are so many. You know, it could be imperial overreach this time by Russia, although it's not far away, it's in the neighborhood. And financially, and it's, I mean, you already see the Russians and Putin asking China for help. So they need help in certain ways, material and other things. And the amount of material flowing into Ukraine from the United States, Georgia, the EU, and NATO is enormous. And that will continue as long as the Russian troops are there, whether it be guerrilla warfare at a certain point. But I can't see how the Russian army is going to fight street to street. And the lesson of Vietnam is that the ant always beats the elephant.
We'll have Maria and then Elaine. Maria, you had something to say?
Yeah, I have a similar thought with Elaine because I just read an article that established that Vladimir Putin is known as someone that have a reptile brain. This means that he sees every single thing in his life as power, as food. He wants everything. And it's really difficult to get an agreement with him. Of course, that happened with all Russian country people, but not all, most of them. And it's really interesting to know that how people just see power, just see food, just want to get involved and more involved, and they want to win. And I firmly believe, taking into account how Vladimir has been acting during these days, that he would not stop. If he don't get what he wants, he would not stop. And that's some of my thoughts, some of my belief. And I also think that this could continue, and this could get worse. And
thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, clearly the metaphor of the day relates to reptiles, ants, other such animals. Elaine?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to respond to Daniel's disagreement with me and say that I'm not sure we're really disagreeing. I'm not suggesting that there's going to be a repeat of what I just described across the country. My concern is a lingering conflict in the sense of the irreparable damage that is being done across Ukraine. Ukraine was trying to knit itself together when I lived there in the 90s and achieved that to a certain extent. But the damage that has been done now, the generations of people who are going to be left filled with hatred for Russia in a way they perhaps weren't before, and the way that could play out beyond shelling and shooting. You can still have conflict without bloodshed, as we know from Northern Ireland, where the death toll was relatively small.
Two questions from the floor, both of which relate to countries near to Ukraine. The first one is, could Russia attack other countries if they succeed with Ukraine? And then the associated question is, do you think that Putin will end the invasion at the Ukrainian borders, or do you think that he has plans to invade other countries in Eastern Europe? Any thoughts on this? Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, I want to go back to the war with Georgia, Russia-Georgia, 2008. And what was interesting was that although the Russian troops were 12 kilometers outside Tbilisi, the real object was South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which were semi-autonomous provinces or districts after the fall of the Soviet Union. Neither of them, the people spoke Georgian, they spoke Russian. So those two became independent. They haven't been recognized by many countries, but they're really not part of Georgia. So the argument would be that if Putin had gone into eastern Ukraine and assured that the Donbass would have some kind of federal cantonal system and be somewhat independent from Ukraine and stop there, that might have been a possibility, because you have Abkhazia, Southern Ossetia, Transnistria in Moldova, which are kind of semi-autonomous. So if he had stopped there, there could have been some kind of negotiation. When he starts going into Kiev or toward Lvov and Western Ukraine, that's a totally different picture. Historically, it's a different picture. Militarily, it's a different picture. So we have to make a distinction between Eastern Ukraine and Western Ukraine, because they're not the same.
Question from a News Decoder correspondent in Africa, Jeremy Solomons. It seems that chemical warfare is more likely, given Obama's invisible line in the sand in Syria when he said that there was a red line if chemical weapons were used in Syria. That line was crossed and the U.S. did not respond forcefully. What should and would the USA and Europe do this time if chemical weapons were used in Ukraine? Any thoughts on that?
I might just complicate that question slightly by noting the reporting that's been coming out of the UK in the last couple of days, reminding us all about the chemical attack that took place there against people in the UK by Russian hands, as an example of Putin showing his willingness to use these kinds of weapons. And I'll just throw that out there. We know he's willing to do it. How the response is something that I would have to be decided on the basis of the circumstances in which it happened. But I think the concern is very real that he will do it.
Any other thoughts on the chemical warfare being used? Daniel?
Well, I mean, I would take that one, Elaine, I would take it one step further. What we all want to know in Europe is about nuclear warfare. I mean, there was the firing near that nuclear plant, and people here in Europe remember Chernobyl. And the only thing that seems to me to save us is the concept of small nuclear weapons has been proven not to be a solution. Kissinger wrote a book, 1957, The Use of Limited Nuclear War, which was disproven by lots of experts. And the second thing is never to forget that Russia is right next to Ukraine. So if he was going to use some kind of nuclear weapon in Ukraine, the wind would blow eastward and he would be in trouble as well. So I don't think that's in the cards. And I do think the red line with Obama is not a good one because they were used and not much was done. But again, that's a violation of international law.
I wondered if we could just conduct a poll now of everyone, panelists and attendees alike. I'm going to post it now. It's on Ukraine's sovereignty. Do you think Ukraine will survive as a sovereign, independent country? I'd be interested in people's views on this. We'll keep it up there for a bit. We have 16 people have responded so far. We'll wait till we have a total of almost 70 people. So we'll wait a minute longer. The question again is, do you think Ukraine will survive as a sovereign, independent country?
You mean Ukraine, Nelson, as it is today, with the same borders?
Yes. I suppose it depends on how you consider the Donbass right now. Is it part of the country? I think internationally it's recognized as part of it. Another 5 seconds, which will be a minute, and we'll publish the results. I hope I can publish the results. There you go. I don't know. Can you see the results, everyone?
Yeah.
So it's a lot closer than I thought it would. 27 out of 50 respondents, so that's 54%, believe that Ukraine will survive as a sovereign, independent nation. 23 out of 50, so 46%. So it's actually quite close. Just gonna write those results down. What do the panelists think about that, either students or correspondents? How did you guys vote? Sophia, Emma, do you think that Ukraine will survive?
We personally said that we do think Ukraine will survive as a sovereign state. And in some way, you can argue that a country is a country and a sovereign state as long as other countries recognize it as a sovereign state. And I think it will take a lot for a country like, for example, the US to say that the Ukraine isn't a sovereign state anymore, but that they are under Russia. So I think it's like the pride of a lot of the Western countries will prevent it becoming under the Russian control, or at least you can say that in some way, maybe some of the parts are going to be under Russian control and they won't have as much independence as they had before. But I think completely removing Ukraine from the world map is unlikely.
Daniel, you're the diplomatic expert here. I'm pulling a blank here, but are there examples of countries which de facto are not sovereign, but de jure in international law are?
Yeah, I mean, the definition of sovereignty is one of recognition, and recognition depends upon which countries recognize you and how many. The example, Kosovo. Is Kosovo a country? For Russia, it's not. Are Southern Ossetia and Abkhazia independent? For the Russians, say, and I think Nicaragua say yes, most of the world says no. So you can have situations where de facto something is true, but de jure it's not. You can have other situations where de jure it's true, but de facto it's not. But it all depends on recognition. That's the big definition. And who recognizes?
Of course, the vote in the UN General Assembly would suggest that Ukraine and its current borders would be recognized internationally.
Now, the second problem with that's the country recognition. Then you get into the question about the recognition of the government, which is the true government, which is not the true government. And that's a secondary corollary problem.
Thank you. There's a question on Putin's popularity. The question is, Putin's popularity soared after Russia invaded Crimea. This time it's different. What made the difference? It's difficult to measure Putin's popularity given the unreliability of the polls there. Does anyone have an idea of whether he is more popular now, less popular? The polls conducted by state-affiliated institutions, I believe, say that his popularity has grown since the invasion of Ukraine. Is there any way of measuring? We see protesters in the streets in various parts of Russia, or are we in the dark here in the West? Jonathan, you were in Moscow for years. Were you able to establish what his popularity was when you were there in any reliable way?
Well, don't forget it's a country of 11 time zones, so it's quite tricky to work out what everybody's thinking. But one of the things that struck me when in the early 2000s, when he stood for the second time in the presidential election, it was quite clear to me that in general he was popular because of what had gone on in the past and what he represented for stability and better prospects for the country and so on. So it looked to me as though he would easily win that election. And yet the Kremlin went out and fiddled and fixed and filled ballot boxes and did all sorts of little tricks to make sure that they won. And I think they would have won handily anyway. But nowadays, it's impossible to say. You just don't know. His line, his argument, I think, still kind of sits well with a lot of Russians, and it's very difficult to grasp that when you're sitting outside Russia. Why on earth this abhorrent behavior should be in any way acceptable? But if you're not getting daily images of people getting slaughtered, hospitals, as we had mentioned before, maternity hospitals getting bombed, you don't know any of that, or you only get, little bits of information. Maybe there isn't enough information out there for a very wide scale change of heart among the population. I'm sure there's plenty of information being fed in from these conscript soldiers and so on, which is worth reminding ourselves is about a quarter of the Russian army is conscript, and anybody who's got any influence never gets called up into the army. So it's kind of the dregs that they get. But no, I would be surprised to see a major shift right now, maybe later, but right now I'm not so sure.
And Jonathan, you were in Moscow in the early years of Putin being in power, I believe. Have you have you noticed changes in his modus operandi, or is this all very, very predictable?
He seems considerably richer, according to Navalny. No, I think he's just tightened the screws more and more. And I think we heard earlier, his paranoia about losing power. I think he's, as you've seen in the last few years, I think he has become, the impression I get is he's increasingly frightened that he can't hold on to power, that this is the behavior of a man who is really quite terrified. But within his world, maybe it makes some sort of sense. But no, I see him as relatively consistent, just increasingly unpleasant.
Question from the floor on nuclear weapons. What do you think about the fact that Putin put his nuclear weapons on standby? Is it a serious threat or not? Daniel?
No, I mean, any kind of conflict or most situations, the nuclear weapons are on standby. I don't think the American weapons would be much different, on alert. And I really think if he's cornered and if he's ill, that people say this will be the last hurrah. But Ukraine is close to Russia. I really don't see that. Can there be an accident? Yes. I mean, Ukraine has the largest nuclear reactor in Europe. It has plenty of other nuclear reactors. By the way, one of the unfortunate things about this conflict is that it's put in the environmental issues kind of along on the side. I mean, if the United States is now going to supply Europe with gas and oil, the question is where they're going to find it. They're going to find it fracking. They're going to find it in the Arctic. They're going to find it off Alaska. So the environmental damage from all of this and the consequences, not just economically for the gas at the pump, but also people, I think the Germans will start using more coal, et cetera, et cetera. So there are consequences of this, which we haven't yet seen.
True, although there's some who say, and this would be a longer term effect, but that some will say it could hasten a move to alternative fuels. Again, it's going to take longer than to restart those coal furnaces or build an LNG port, et cetera, et cetera. So it's true, and of course, the U.S. has reopened its lines of communication with Venezuela, which is a major change in its policies.
And Iran as well. I mean, the question of Germany and Italy, the percentage of gas and oil in Europe that comes from Russia is extremely high. And the gas prices here and just the reliance. So when the Germans said they were closing the Nord Stream oil gas pipe, it was a major event.
I got a question of everyone, actually. What happens if a Russian missile strikes a NATO country? Yesterday, they struck very near something like less than 15 miles from the Polish border. What happens if a missile hits a neighboring NATO member country, or kills some NATO personnel? What happens then? Any thoughts on that? Would NATO automatically retaliate militarily? What's the scenario, Jonathan?
I think they have to under the NATO agreement. Take some, according to Biden the other day, that they will defend every inch or centimeter of NATO territory. So they would have to react. Quite how they would react, I don't know. But
one of the rules of international law deals with what's called proportionality. So if it's one person, it's not a question of Article 5 of the NATO agreement, the Washington Treaty, which says an attack on one country is an attack on all. It depends on how serious the attack is. But unless Putin is totally suicidal, I just can't see him going into one of the NATO countries. If there's a missile that happens to go someplace that it shouldn't, I don't think that would cause a total NATO reaction. I think proportionality would play.
Fair enough. But the question was not whether he would do so. The question is, what does NATO do if a shell does land on NATO territory? That's
my point. Yeah, my point was about proportionality.
So they would respond, but in proportion.
I would hope so.
And one missile, what's the proportionate response? You send up one missile towards Russian troops?
Well, it would depend if the missile is aimed at a base, at a NATO base, for example, then the Russian base is going to disappear.
Escalation, in other words.
Tit for tat.
Tit for tat. Tit for tat. There you go. We have one more poll. We have 5 more minutes. Let's do another poll. Hold on. This one is, I'm going to get into trouble with Daniel on negotiated end. It's, do you believe an end to fighting can be negotiated? Yes or no? So, do you believe an end to fighting can be negotiated? I suppose, Daniel, your point is that it will always be negotiated. I guess it's in the short or medium term, I should say. We've got 20 answers.
Whilst we're doing the poll, could I kindly ask a question?
Yeah, the question is, do you want me to repeat the question, Daniel?
No, I was saying, could I ask a question?
Absolutely, please do.
Okay, thank you. And so, in regards to the Monroe Doctrine and to the fact that the West has been guilty of basically invading so many countries, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the US has invaded or toppled regimes in more than 50 countries and maintains more than 800 countries in the world. Can we consider the US to be hypocritical in terms of what is going on right now?
Is the US hypocritical? That's the long view. Daniel, you said you mentioned Vietnam earlier. What do you think?
Well, I mean, if we're looking at a crime of aggression and the illegal use of force, the United States will never sign that treaty. Monroe Doctrine still was the 19th century, was keeping Europeans out. In the question now of Putin, the United States is hypocritical. Obviously, you can mention Iraq and Syria. We could go on and on. But here, it's not the same thing as the 50s and 60s. It's not communism going all over the world. It's just dealing for the moment with Russia's neighbors. So although you can talk about sphere of influence, it's not quite the same thing as European countries going in to South America or the United States going to Vietnam or to Latin America, even, or to Africa, certainly. So there are distinctions there about sphere of influence, but the concept I understand. Yeah, good point.
The poll shows, with respect to a negotiated end, do you believe an end to fighting can be negotiated? Very close. 20 out of 39, so 51% believes there can be a negotiated settlement, and 49% say no. We have time for one last question because we're coming to the top of the hour, and this one comes from the Balkans. Alison Carragher. Speaking of the access regular Russians have to information, do the students or the correspondents believe Instagram should have closed its services off in Russia? Relatedly, should other platforms have waived their hate speech restrictions to allow for angry Ukrainian responses to the invasion? So a social media question. Students, what do you think? Yes, please.
I believe that it's very important that both the Russians and the Ukrainians have access to social media platforms, especially the Russians, because there are so much restrictions on what they can say. But I think I read an article just this morning that now Instagram is closed in Russia, and that is done by Putin. So yeah, I do believe it's very important that they have access.
Yep, Sophia.
Yeah, I also think it's important that they have access, especially now that there's come such like censor on the Russian media. Mm-hmm. So there's no free Russian media left. So the only way you, as a Russian, can get access to information that doesn't come from the Russian state is by social media, or if you have contacts outside of Russia.
Thank you. We have Kea and then Maria, and then we'll have to close it out.
Yeah, I definitely agree, because I think social media is one of the limited outlets that many Russians and Ukrainians have to express their emotions, especially Russians. So I believe that it's extremely important for them to have that outlet, and it's kind of detrimental to both the outside world and other Russians if we don't get to hear their opinions because of the censorship. And I think it's like also supportive to other Russians to hear similar opinions and hear that their opinions are being supported and get outside opinions.
Thank you. We have Maria, and then last will be Danielle in Ghana. Maria.
Thank you. So I completely agree with what just all my panelists said. And I also believe that it's really important to have access to the social media, because this could help us to have two perceptions, a perception of their own reality and the perception that other social media show us. So it's really important to have this kind of activate social media with that Russian people today, as I already said, so they can show us all this reality that maybe we don't know and maybe people don't show. And also they can use it to talk, to express, and yeah.
And the view from Africa, Danielle?
Yes, I believe that the restrictions should be removed in regards to censorship of social media, especially in Russia, because it violates the freedom of speech, which is a violation of human rights, first of all. And it restricts the amount of information one can receive from the perspective of those not found in the government. It's very important and very integral for us to be able to know about what's going on within the society without the government necessarily feeding it towards us. And in addition to that, the lack of access can actually lead to ignorance as to what is going on within that state. And so it's very important to remove censorship of social media.
I'm going to take liberty of asking a question of the students, and then we'll close off. But it relates to social media. How essential is social media for you all in your understanding of what's going on in Ukraine? Sophia, Emma, is social media playing a really important role for informing you about what's going on in Ukraine?
I think so, because we can now see videos from people our own age who are in the middle of Ukraine and in the middle of war. And they can tell their truth and what they have personally experienced. And I think it's really helping to influence us who are in a safe country, so we can see what is actually happening, and maybe also really understand how hard and how tough it is.
I also believe that in terms of the refugees, social media plays a big part in planning how you get refugees from the border between Ukraine and Poland to other countries like Germany and up to Denmark and some of the more Western countries. Yeah.
Okay. Kea, your hand's up.
Yes, so as someone who doesn't know any Ukrainians personally, I think that social media has definitely helped, because I get to see their point of view. And on many social media outlets, I've seen many people posting what their life is like every day. And it talks about being in a bunker, hearing bombings, and just that, I believe, is very important, to not see these people as a statistic and see people as people. And I think just that increases people's humanity and morality to help out and, like we were talking about earlier, make sacrifices for their sake.
Thank you. I'm not being very disciplined. We're 4 minutes past the hour, but we have 2 more students, and then we're going to close it off. So let's have Maria and then Danielle.
Thank you. So I also believe that social media helps a lot. However, we have the fake news and the real news. What happened with the fake news? What happened with that information that fake news give to us? So maybe that's a problem I found out with this social media aspect. However, the real information really helped us to understand what's going on, the reality, as also what Kaya said, it helps us to see how people afford this difficult situation as human beings. So yeah, that are my 2 points, the fake news and how does that affect us and the information we get, and the real news that also help a lot with all this understanding of the situation.
Indeed, social media is not necessarily a terrifically accurate reflection of what's going on at all times. It could be manipulated, and it's not necessarily beholden to the truth. Last but not least, Danielle.
Yes, so I think social media has been very helpful in providing me with access to information in regards to the Russo-Ukrainian war, ongoing war. Firstly, because it provides a way for me to be able to connect with whatever is going on, helps us to be able to relate to the humanity, basically, and get various perspectives of everything that's going on. For example, I think a few weeks ago, I got insights into in regards to some of the children of the oligarchs and the impact of some of the sanctions on their families. And so that was very helpful in helping me understand the situation that was going on.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank everyone who's been on camera, our students, our correspondents, also those who dialed in and have attended off camera for your many questions. Thank you very much. This has been, I believe, our most interactive session ever in News Decoder, which reflects, of course, the intense interest in this incredibly important issue. True to our mission, we've had young people and older people around the same table because I think it's absolutely vital to have that kind of dialogue. So I want to thank everyone, including those in the Americas, for joining us so early in the day. And thank you all for joining, and I wish you all the very best. Thank you.
Bye.